valid. So for me, what does the dressing in white for you? Because it's not just dressing in white. The first 3 months, it is a very strictly disciplined life where you are home by a certain time. Even if you work, and then you go straight home. Uh, you eat on the floor on your mat. You you lead a very almost monastic life, even though you're still a part of the outside world. But by forcing you home, what does that help do? What does this time of extreme purity, even if it's just for a year, what does it help you do? In a way, it sort of extends the sequester period indirectly. And what I mean by that, if you're not going to a bar after work, you have to go home, and when you're home, you have to live a a more strict and more disciplined life than usual. Well, what are you going to do with that during that time? If your godparents, if you're or your ulu, that everybody understands, your Baba Orisha, um, doing the right thing, you have material to study. You have your ita to study, to learn, to memorize. You have prayers, you have songs, so that you can be a functioning devotee once your year is over. Now, if you just, you know, let the time pass and don't use it for anything, which unfortunately is what most happens with most people, then I think you miss out on a blessing. But if you consider that time in white as the extension of the sequester period, then it is a profoundly spiritual act. And just to give more uh, evidence um, towards my theory, um, I want to invoke the at least something I've read amongst the Dahomey, right? The people of the Benin Republic. I'm not sure if it's still called Benin Republic, um, which are neighbors of the Yoruba. They even share many Orisha, Legba, Ogu, Fa or Afa, which is Ifa. Okay, many Orishas they share. They don't call them Orishas; they call them Vodou. But for example, essentially, if you were getting initiated, you're being sequestered for a long time because when you left it, you were a functional priest. You didn't leave there a layperson. You left there a functional priest, whereas opposed to in Lukumi, initiation is just at the very beginning. You don't know anything, right? And one of the stories that they have as to why their sequester period is so long is that it actually used to be longer. And I've already said this before about Lukumi. There's these tales that in the old days it was longer, but in this story, the ancient sequester period was 8 years. 8 years to study and become a proficient priest before you were released back into public. And the story was that there was this one initiate who was sequestered, and every day this beautiful woman would walk by, and they sort of, I guess she was a priestess too, which is why she was allowed in the area. I don't know, but the point is, they sort of fell in love, and they sort of they had relations, and of course that he broke the taboo of living in the temple. The sequester 8 years would have supposed to be 8 years of celibacy, like a monk or a nun, and so of course they killed him for breaking the taboo. But this woman was madly in love with him, and she cared for him so much that she demanded to be killed as well and go into the go to heaven to be with him. And long story short, at the door of the temple, a big flame erupts, and she goes in. She's able to bring him out, much like the Greek stories. And so from that day forward, the gods themselves announced that from 8 years, the sequester period is reduced to 8 months. Now, I want you to think about that. At the time that this was written, which was in the book that I read, late 1800s, maybe early 1900s, you still had an 8 month actual sequester period actually being practiced. I want you to think about that, right? And so the idea of these long sequester periods is not, a fantasy or a myth. This is what was actually done. And so there's you can find some traditional value in the syncretism, right? What I think is that many times, at least in the 1700s, 1800s, a lot of those Africans and the children of Africans, they were sort of piecing things together the best they could, and incorporating these concepts. A lot of times they weren't even very well versed in Christianity, right? All they had was the images. So for them, there was no really theology behind the Christian images, right? You have to understand that many times the church itself admonished the slave owners, specifically because they said the only reason we're backing you in the slavery thing is because you promised to raise good Catholics and create good Catholics, and then they'd go and they'd go to the plantations, the priests, the monks, and whatever, and like, wow, these guys don't know anything about Catholicism, and so essentially, probably the slave owner probably once a month showed them a couple pictures of saints, and then that was it. So these guys, at first, probably didn't have a solid Christian background. So any syncretism that happened, at least in the beginning, it was probably very superficial, and so they did the best that they could. Trying to think of another really good example. And okay, so I'm going to go just more about syncretism in general. In the beginning, I said that syncretism essentially happens in all religions, and we seem to be a little bit more militant about the Catholic imagery because the Catholic was an oppressive force, as opposed to sometimes other syncretisms that happen more organically, more naturally, because friendships, maybe people traveling for trade and mercantilism, they'll adopt this custom from another people, or that custom, or things just happen over time as opposed to being forced. So I think that's one of the big differences, but we can't deny that syncretism does happen. One of the greatest examples is Ifa itself. So, you know, when I first started learning about traditional Yoruba, like Ifa in Nigeria, not in Cuba, but Nigeria, right? One of my first interactions were with the writings, and I actually got to meet Baba Wande Abimbola. It was such a wise man. Bless him and bless his children who are keeping the tradition going. But one of the things in his writing is, and he's not the only one, I've read it many times since, and I'll even give examples of one of my own elders to teach me this, but that Otura Meji is Ifa Imale. Now, we also say this in Cuba. Otura Meji Ifa Imale is something that you hear in Cuba, and it's something you hear in Nigeria. But what is Imale in Yoruba? I'm not going to talk about the Cuban meaning of Imale. I'm going to talk about the Yoruba. Imale is the word for Islam, right? And there is absolutely no doubt that when we say Ifa Imale, there is reference to Islam. Problem is, Islam doesn't reach the west coast of Africa until about, 700 AD? Maybe a little bit later, by the time we got to Nigeria, west coast. So, we, so either, so how did Ifa begin speaking about Islam if it's pretty recent? So either Ifa itself isn't that old, or Ifa is older than its interaction with Islam, but the concepts or the interactions with the people, sort of, there was a syncretism within the corpus, and that's why Ifa can speak about Islam. It does speak about Islam. In the book by Ayo Salami, may Allah Dumare keep his spirit blessed. He definitely died too soon, but in his book that has helped a lot of students, he even has a verse in there that mentions an obvious reference to the Christian Jesus. And it happens, and there's no need to vilify. The book is a great book, and I study it still vigorously. I don't memorize it because I'm not a babalao, but I study the content. And it's a great book, and there's no need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay?